Can we start, please? Can we start, please? Can I ask people to please take a seat? Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming for the second keynote speech for the City Debates Conference. I'm very happy to be the discussant and to be presenting Professor Asef Bayat, who's a very prominent sociologist and one who's influenced me a lot and a lot of my students who are here. Professor Bayat is the Catherine and Bruce Bastian Professor of Global and Transitional Studies. He teaches sociology in Middle East and the Middle East at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. His research areas range from social movements and social change to religion and politics, Islam and the modern world, and urban spaces and politics. His forthcoming book is entitled Revolutions Without Revolutionaries, Making Sense of the Arab Spring, and today we will be discussing a chapter or part of this book with the focus on squares and counter-squares in the Arab uprisings. Professor Bayat, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? No. Can you hear me now? Yes. Thank you, Rima, for the introduction. And I'd like to thank, of course, both Moya and Heba, for and many others who have organized city debates for many years. In fact, this is my fourth Christmas here. And somebody asked me yesterday, how do you do it? Well, I said I have some wasta here in the department, both among the professors and the students, who then become wasta, and so it's just getting better and better. So as Rima said, this is actually part of the book that hopefully will come out in the spring. This is in fact the first volume of my analysis of the Arab uprisings. I'm currently working on the second volume, which is the story of the subaltern in the Arab revolutions, what Arab revolution really means for the ordinary people. But today, discussion is somewhat different. It is about somewhat Arab squares, or theoretically speaking, is about urbanity and insurrection. Now, as we remember, about 6 years ago or so, and earlier, the revolts of the 2010s in the Middle East, whether the Green Rebellion in Iran or the Arab uprisings and the Gezi Park protests in Turkey took place mostly in the cities. Now the question for me has been, what does this urban locus of the uprisings in the Middle East, where according to the official figures 40% of the population live in the countryside or in the rural areas, what does it really means in terms of the origin and dynamics of the uprisings? But more specifically, what aspects of urbanity makes the cities the spaces of contention? And why certain sites, streets or squares, are more than others conducive for mobilization? Now, I've been trying to observe in the past, a couple of decades, certain cities in the Middle East, especially Tehran and Cairo, and a little bit of Istanbul, and more recently Tunis, especially after the uprising. But having done that, I'd like to suggest, on the basis of my observation, that what shapes the urban contention in these cities are there paradoxical dynamics, but this paradoxical dynamics operates within a particular political economies. So my propositions are very simple, that urbanity generates certain, in the inhabitants, certain needs and obligations, yet it also inculcates certain entitlements and rights. It enforces certain constraints on how to live an urban life, and yet offers extraordinary sort of opportunities for forging and expressing collective dissent. But these dynamics and the resulting kind of contention and dissent finds a particular resonance, or rather it gets kind of intensified and gets sharpened, especially under autocratic polity and neoliberal economy. And this combination has been with us in the Middle East for perhaps over the last 2 decades or so. And this is what has been happening. Let me elaborate on these. People from different walks of life joined the Arab revolts, the middle class, urbanized, the youth, women, laborers, segments of the slum dwellers, as well as people from the provincial areas. But the insurrections were remarkably urban in character. Millions poured into the streets en masse, marching in the main streets, holding massive rallies in the key strategic locations, occupying central urban squares, spending days and nights in them. When protesters in the Tunisia moved from the provincial towns of, and by the way, for the first time I'm showing actually pictures. That's recently I have learned how to do it, and I'm so excited about it. See, this happens. So there are more. So when the protesters actually moved from the provincial towns of Sidi Bouzid, Bouzaïn and Kasserine and others northward toward the capital city, Bourguiba Avenue became the kind of center, epicenter of contention in Tunisia. And then Cairo's Tahrir Square came to epitomize the uprising street politics par excellence. And before long, the idea of Tahrir moved to other Arab cities, like Yemen's Tahrir squares in Sana'a, Tripoli's Green Square, and Bahrain's, of course, Pearl Square. But as battles rage and tear gas overtook these squares, so did life and levity and sociality. Mass rallies, banners, and makeshift tents, medical teams, cleaning crews, and security groups, discussion groups, food and music, all became part of square life. Activists, men and women, Muslim and Christian, spent night times in the makeshift tents. They were then joined by ordinary men and women, children, and elderly together, turning these sort of battlefields, sort of meidans, into evenings of carnivalesque, with street vendors shouting for hot tea, cold drinks, and tear gas masks. As days passed by, these squares seemed to become a microcosm of alternative order. The revolutionaries seemed to kind of aspire democratic governance, horizontalism, self-help, cooperation, and altruism. In the Sana'a's Tahrir Square, the large banner read, "Welcome to the land of liberty." And the surrounding streets were renamed as Adl, or justice, and Hurriya, or freedom. Here, in these squares, strangers met and engaged, and gender, religious, and class divides seemed to dissipate, leaving the square with an extraordinary sense of solidarity and sacrifice. The idea of Tahrir then traveled to Tel Aviv, Madrid, Bangkok, Sao Paulo, and Istanbul, continuing with Ukraine's Maidan Square. In fact, their revolution is called Maidan Revolution.
But revolutionary mobilizations were not limited to the large and capital cities. The provincial small towns also became sort of the hotbed of revolutionary upheavals. In Tunisia, the revolt, after all, began in the depressed town of Sidi Bouzid, spreading through Bouzayin, and Qasrin, and Kafsa, and Jandouba, and others, before, of course, reaching Tunis. In Egypt, we had Suez, Mahalla, Port Said, Ismailia, and so on, of course, you know. In Yemen, of course, Saada and Taiz. And not to mention, of course, in Syria, where the uprising sort of sparked from such provincial towns of Dar'a, Hama, Homs, Deir Zur, and Raqqa, and others. In Hama, on 2nd of July 2011, some 200,000 Syrians protested occupying Asi Square in the very city where in 1982 the Ba'athist regime had put down the rebellion by massacring about 20,000 protesters. Now these events have produced an extraordinary interest in the idea of urban space and politics, and a real sort of fascination with the idea of Maidan. It looks like we are kind of moving from an earlier sort of digital turn, that is exclusive kind of focus on Facebook revolution, social media, and so on, into spatial turn in the analysis of the Arab Revolution. So there is a lot of actually literature really is emerging, and I think this is a good development. Yet while there is recognition that city space is important in contentious politics, debates continues as to why it is so and how it is so. Actually, attention to space in social movement theory is pretty new. In fact, in the past decade or so, when a number of discussions emerged in the journal Mobilization, and actually Tillich, actually before his death, invoked space, pretty for the first time, and then others continued. Of course, you had in your discipline, in urban planning, of course, space is very central. But the connection between urban planning and social movement theory or sociology has been not very good. And I think this is this session actually is a good one. I mean, this conference and debates, city debates, are a good one to connect these disciplines and these debates. So, despite the fact that, of course, space had existed in the political writings of Marx, the factory system, Weber, City, and of course Lefebvre and Foucault. But these insights certainly are helpful, but we need still to be more precise. What, for instance, in particular, what is particular urban about urban social contention? I think last session actually we had some question about this. What possesses in the cities what processes in the cities induce insurgent citizens? What elements in urban sites make them Maidan Tahrir or Taqsim or Tablir? And what is the relevance or the value of kind of a Tahrir moment for emancipatory politics? After all, is all about space? What about the broader impact of political economies? Should we not account for the role of social agents, those actors in the arenas of the insurgent spaces? I think these are the questions that I like to address here. Now, many observers, in addressing these questions, many observers point to the symbolic power, meaning the political history of those of certain sites like Cairo's Tahrir or Manama's Kurd Square. Yes, but the symbolic significance changes as the city, of course, transforms. During Abdel Nasser, for instance, it wasn't Maidan Tahrir, which was the center of protestation, but it was Abdin Piazza, which it was a kind of piazza in the sense of piazza of speech and balcony that reminds one of Ceausescu or what happened in Leipzig, before their or during their uprising. Others emphasize the massive number of bodies in the streets to question those who deem the Arab Spring as Facebook revolution, arguing that there was actually a connection between the digital and the spatial. Some have focused on the performative aspects of insurrections, Tahrir as theater, so sort of underlying the emergence of new democratic politics, horizontalism, and cooperative order. People like Jeff Alexander, who brought about the book a few months after the Egyptian revolution. But most seem to be overwhelmed by the allure of Agora, the intimate, sort of egalitarian and convivial order where hierarchies of gender, religion, and class dissipates. Alam Badu and Zizek, for instance, saw in these revolutionary moments the promise of a new social order that could serve as a foundation for sort of different kinds of futures. Still others spoke of Arendian sort of Greek police. So the Tahrir as the Arendian Greek police, representing a form of government that relied heavily on self-rule and common sense initiative with no single sovereign ruler. Of course, these performative sort of features one could see in the Occupy movement as well, and I observed when I participated in Toronto's St. James Park. I'm sure you have participated in many others. Now, of course, the innovative and egalitarian spirit of square activism deserves our intellectual attention. I think these are significant moments that has to be documented and think about. But I think that the square life of this sort were none of those. I think the square life of this sort actually is a liminal reality, a kind of transitory egalitarian community that navigates between the real and unreal. To me, it actually resonates more with the notion of communitas, Victor Turner's communitas, in the sense of an egalitarian community of equal individuals who break away temporarily from the everyday norms and structures of power to operate in an ad hoc state of liminality. In fact, these are the social formations of exceptional moments in great political upheavals and should not be mistaken for what activists can or cannot do when everybody goes home. In other words, it should be mistaken with what activists can do in the larger structures and national settings. In other words, an overemphasis on the speciality of these democratic moments shouldn't lead us to overlook their temporality. That is, this crucial fact that these democratic and egalitarian instances have typically ad hoc and exceptional existence. As much as the function of a space, they are also a product of history. Perhaps we need to take account of political economy and structural sort of dynamics seriously. Something like what David Harvey, I think, does nicely in his comments on Arab uprisings and Occupy movements. But unfortunately, his broad, very broad, large-scale analysis falls short of offering any sort of ethnographic insights to show how really the operation of capital and its spatial configuration actually creates urban insurgents. In fact, there is little rebellion in his book, The Rebel Cities, which actually appeared in the wake of the Arab Spring and Occupy movements. It's all about the aggressive encroachment of capital on the cities and larger geographies to dispossess the working classes. Even his very engaging interview in Jadaliyya with our Heba here and the friend actually follows similar lines. Consequently, we really don't learn much about how, if at all, the urban dispossessed fights back, nor do we know how these processes are especially linked to the role of the state. In fact, state is missing. The state is missing in these observation, in these analysis, because the state does matter. The nature of, remember this morning we were talking about there are different types of the states, right? And the nature of the states matter as long as to show us how the working classes dispossessed can or cannot fight back, whether there is a space or there isn't a space, and so on. But Saskia Sassen, a sociologist, who also commented on the Arab Spring in an article called Global Street, the Arab Spring and the Occupy movement, but especially the Arab Spring, makes an interesting point that the ecology of the city, a kind of a dense juxtaposition of lives, places, and streets, makes powerlessness, she says, problematic or complicated. In other words, she's saying that it makes powerless to make history, because the states simply cannot pulverize the city and its inhabitants when the rebellion begins. So they can resist. Never mind that Assad regime in Syria did level the city of Hama, killing 20,000 people to quell the uprising in 1980, and repeated similar herbicide in Dar'a and Homs, and more recently in Aleppo, when, of course, the uprising began afterwards. Nevertheless, Sassen's point remains important. But still, we do not learn how urbanity turns inhabitants into insurgents in the first place, nor her deployment of the street, something different from the European ritualized piazza in these events, reveal anything about how it may facilitate or impede dissent and insurgency. Now, I've suggested that at least three inherent factors may potentially make modern cities in the Middle East as spaces of contention. First is the urban problematics, that is, the urban processes, obligation, entitlements that would stand at the roots of contention. Second is the urban actors with particular needs, demands, desires, and subjectivities. And the third is the existence of urban spaces, both physical and social space, that may facilitate political mobilization. Let me elaborate on these. Now, modern urbanity generates particular needs, like cash for exchange, rather than relying on trust or reciprocity. Need to learn work discipline rather than being flexible or self-arranged, or undertake contracts as opposed to relying on negotiation or customary norms. Modern urbanity also generates certain desires and demands, like paid jobs, like regular pay, particular norms of consumption. But it simultaneously cultivates certain entitlements and rights, like the right to have optimum urban amenities, running water, electricity, garbage collection, and so forth. Of course, these needs changes when the societal standards shift. Now, any violation of these expectations and these kind of entitlements is likely to generate dissent. So some of you might know that in my childhood, I've been actually born in a small village of about 150 Azeri-speaking family in central Iran. It was a very backward village in the sense of infrastructure and so forth. So my mother, to run the household, for instance, for water, she would go from faraway places, from qanat or underground wells, to actually fetch water. And that was her everyday things. She had to do it. To warm up a house, she had to make wood fires, right? And so on. That was her job, and this was what she used to do. Then, for whatever reason, we moved to the cities, largely because there was no school. and in South Tehran. But in the South Tehran slum area, we had electricity and we had running water. And my mother actually would turn the tap and the water would come out. It was big. This is big. Or she would actually touch the button and you have electricity and you could actually warm up the house. It was a real liberation for her. I could see in her eyes. But then as time passed, and sometimes we had power cottage, or water cottage, she would get angry, upset. She would say like, Eda, of course she wouldn't speak Arabic, but, or Inchie, what is this, what kind of government we have, and so on and so forth. In other words, she developed this entitlement. She became an urban citizen. She knew her rights and the violation would anger her and create outrage in her. My father, who was first a truck driver and then a bus driver, he was very sensitive about potholes. So for a long time, he actually driving things in the dirt road in the village. And I actually would go with him. So he wouldn't complain. But when we moved to the city, as soon as he actually crosses, a road in which it has pothole, he would scream, "What kind of government we have? What kind of country is this?" and so on. He became a citizen and developed this consciousness about, his entitlements. I could see such sort of reactions on the part of many of our migrant relatives in the slums of South Tehran. So as many years later, then I became a privileged scholar, and I could observe very similar attitudes among the poor families in Cairo's Dar es Salaam, in Hizbat Khairullah, Ramat Bulag, and other neighborhoods. In fact, these very issues, garbage-infected sort of streets and sort of irregular supply of piped water in Cairo became a big issue, as you know, before the uprising, which actually the media at the time called thirst revolution. But of course, you also have had in this city about the garbage revolution. Yes. But the Arab uprisings, as we saw, involved mobilization not just in large cities, but also in the small and provincial towns, and even in some villages. Now it is tempting to ponder, as some have, as to why small and provincial towns have been the locus of revolutionary protest. But the very question, I think, presupposes certain image about small towns as traditional communities with provincial habits, customs, and environment, which are presumably inimical to collective action in pursuit of democratic polity. Such imagery invokes the well-known sort of Tunis and Zimmel dichotomy of village, small town, as opposed to city or metropolis, where the small town or village is identified as a place of traditional institutions, extended family, community, and consensus-based relationship, whereas the city is marked by, as a locus of cosmopolitanism, interest groups, individualism, and of course state control. But I think the reality of provincial towns in the Middle East is very different from Zimmel's late 19th century model. In truth, the Middle Eastern traditional towns, as well as villages, I think, have been in the process of profound transformation in the past 3 decades or so, as they have come to experience the growing capitalist relations, commodification, growing literacy, and higher education, means of communication, consumer ethos, youth consciousness, urban needs and opportunities. I think, it might be a hybrid social formation is being created, where the inhabitants are, in some way, are informed by by the issues related to both urban and rural, issues of land, irrigation of water, loan issues and so on, but at the same time bills for water, drinking water, or electricity, and so on and so forth. So a deep social change, I think, brought the provincial and rural into the orbit of a national society and politics, turning them into geographies of wider political dissent. I think during the uprisings, they developed their own Tahrir squares. But why such particular squares and streets like Tahrir or Taqsim or Tahrir, or not others, became the locus of monumental contention? Why are certain spaces are more insurgent than others? A number of specificities are involved, which I have already actually taught in my book, but I'm extending it and revising it. First, the spaces of insurrection are usually those that enjoy certain symbolic, historical significance, but especially sites surrounded by government offices, presidential palaces, a memory of struggle, and so forth. Secondly, those are usually in close proximity to intellectual and cultural happenings, sites close to university campuses, large mosques, bookstores, or cultural cafes. And here we see certain cultural milieu, critical constituencies or nonconformists, groups that provide or espouse alternative lifestyles. Third, these are the locus of mass transportation networks, terminals and buses and taxis, which actually can bring crowd and bring them out. Fourth, there is the element of course, spatial flexibility, where a mobile and agile crowd can easily and rapidly assemble in a vast spans of these squares while being able to disperse when the police comes. In fact, I think if you compare Tahrir to Rab Adawiya, Rab Adawiya is the square where the Sisi regime killed hundreds of protesters, Muslim brothers who were there. And one actually spatial problematic was the blocks were very long and there weren't side streets, so that actually when the police comes they can actually disappear. And therefore they were kind of stuck there. And finally, of course, is the element of anonymity and unknowability, as Raymond Williams put it. This is central to the Maidan politics because it provides a sense of liberty of action, which otherwise would be subject to social control. So, in fact, in a lot of cities, we know that the activists, for instance, in their own neighborhood, they go to Maidan to not to be known, right? Or even from the villages. Now, an irony of all this is that these modernist vast squares and boulevards had been inspired by the ideas of French Baron Haussmann. And of course, Cairo got the idea from Paris, and Bourguiba Boulevard actually was built during colonial French. So these were originally actually designed, among other things, to prevent riots and revolution. But in fact, they serve precisely the opposite. As it is known in 1850s and 80s, 1860s, Haussmann redesigned, as you know, the traditional ecology of Paris for infrastructure. But one element, of course, was to get rid of the kind of unruly sort of neighborhoods, the small 1 to 5 meter sort of curvy neighborhoods, so that it could make it more transparent for police gaze and also the movement of the police cars and so on. Or the movement of soldiers and so forth. And this sort of urban design was to turn the, as I said, unruly and opaque neighborhoods into more legible, transparent. It aimed to facilitate easy movement of traffic and police in those areas and expose, of course, the potential protesters to police gaze and prevent the construction of barricades. But why did the revolts in the Middle East take place in those very squares, in those Haussmannian sort of spaces, were supposed to actually prevent or offset such revolts? I think that Haussmann's plan was prevalent at the time when the rioting and barricading were the main repertoire of contention. Because repertoire of contention really changed. It really predates the prevalence of mass demonstration and rallies and so forth, which came to actually take full advantage of the very vastness of these squares. And so the protesters in Cairo, Tunis, Istanbul, and Sana'a, they actually did the same. They used these spaces for their symbolism, sociology, and ease of movements, and above all for their openness and magnitude. But let's remember that these are the cities where central streets are bustling with human bodies, largely because they have become what I call the cities inside out, where a great number of the inhabitants function, subsist, and reproduce economic and cultural life in the outdoor public spaces. So people were out there in public, working, walking, sitting, driving, loitering, praying, socializing, and being present. It was practically subverting sort of any official prohibition and curfews. In fact, in Egypt, curfews were imposed, but actually didn't really work. And usually women are the most important curfew breakers for their particular maternal impunity. So you go out, well, I need milk for my child, and so on. So you go through tanks and so forth. So what could the regimes now do in their counter-square strategies? In Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, the Arab Spring also caused lots of excitement among dissenting youth and at the sort of much panic among the ruling elites. But unlike the social media, the city saw no street unrest, except for the iconic lone protester Khalid al-Juhani, one person only who appeared in where he was supposed to, and now that person is in jail. And the organizer, of course, who initiated this initiative, was shot dead even before he went to that spot. It's true that Saudi regime quickly moved to criminalize street demonstrations as against, and I quote, Islamic laws and our society's values, unquote, while dispensing some $36 billion reward in the form of interest-free home loans, unemployment assistance, and things like this. But in fact, the spatial reality of Riyadh, I think, would hinder public protestation. So modern Riyadh offers a little really outdoor public space. If you've been, you have noticed. Is quite actually anti-public even. Vast streets with fast cars, but empty people. So to make any small public gathering would be really odd and suspect. Public gathering usually is limited to lower class neighborhoods like Al-Bata, which is largely in the place of South Asian immigrants and merchants, or the massive or spectacular malls, which of course is surrounded and is constant control of or gaze of Shorta police. In Syria, the regime was determined to prevent anything like Tahrir to emerge. So when protesters in April 2011 took over the Maidan, the main square in Homs to camp in, the security forces went in and killed, according to protesters, 200 people. In Bahrain, in Bahrain, rulers recaptured the Pearl Square, Manama's Tahrir, in March 2011, bulldozed its ground and grass, and violently flattened the Pearl Monument. In Egypt, during the uprising, the regime couldn't do much, or didn't want to do much. But we can talk about this. But after the revolution, as the protests continued, the new military rulers began their counter-square plans. First by blocking, some key intersecting streets in Tahrir Square, by placing sort of massive blocks, kind of violent barriers that inspired sometimes very memorable sort of revolutionary graffitis. Second, they wanted to diminish the image of Tahrir as a space of insurrection through neglect. For some time, actually, Tahrir Square was infested by garbage and so on. They wanted to kill that memory. And then under General Sisi, they tried to do it through new architectural interventions. So the new, at the time, dismal and remarkably unspectacular Monument of Revolution, this is the Monument of Revolution, constructed in Tahrir Square under General Sisi, reflected how the counter-revolution wished the Tahrir to be, or in fact not to be, remembered. It was vandalized and lasted only few months before being replaced by an excessively lofty Egyptian flag higher than nearby Mugamma building, which tells more about the military power than the memory of the revolution. Then came, of course, the famous idea of relocating Cairo, with all its state institutions, into new 45 billion capital city in the desert. So the initial design, which was published with UAE investment, pointed to a city similar in morphology to those in Persian Gulf, with no apparent public squares and central spaces. Now, spatial relocation for fear of urban insurgency is not new. President Ahmed, even in the region, President Ahmadinejad of Iran, just after 2009 Green Revolt, also planned to relocate 1/2 of Tehran's population into different cities to actually dilute the population, and in fact they tried to increase the population of the rural areas. General Franco's of Spain did succeed in transferring Barcelona University, a bastion of anti-fascist street politics, to a different location, but the relocation plans of President Ahmadinejad encountered a problem, and in fact it's been somewhat tabled, and General Sisi is back and forth, but it seems that it's going on. Somebody said something will appear, but we still don't know. Now, to end with the current structures of the new liberal economy and autocratic polity in the Middle East, the city life and the space remains still conducive for further possible popular eruptions. Thank you very much. I appreciate your attention.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you very much, Asif. It's always enjoyable to hear all these thought-provoking ideas and try to engage with them. So I was given the difficult task of commenting on this very, very interesting and beautifully written chapter. And every time I read a book or a chapter of Asif, I find myself agreeing to many of, I read and I agree, but then I stop and I think, I have a few comments, but I don't really know how to articulate them because he's so nuanced in how he poses his ideas that he touches on. So he somehow preempts criticism by touching on all different aspects of the social world that is complex and of course difficult to understand. So what I'll try to do now is I'll play the devil's advocate a bit. And having said that, I really enjoyed and I think it's a very interesting chapter and some really good ideas for social scientists and specifically scholars of social movement, because it is true that the concept of space and urbanity has been missing in the literature of social movement, and it's only very recently that we're picking up on that. So you probably know a lot more about urbanism and urbanity than I do, but I'll try to think of it from a sociological lens. So, I mean, as mentioned, there has been, since the Arab uprisings, the first turn or the first wave has been mainly focused on the idea of the digital turn. And it's, I mean, both turns, the first and the second, are trying to engage with the idea of the public sphere. So the first one that described the revolutions as Facebook revolutions, the role of social media, etc. But the second one, and where this contribution is more looking at space, the importance of squares, and this question of, I mean, there is a big literature on numbers, on protest size, but not very much on the space where the protests take place. And I think, Asef, you're very right to make many critical questions about the notion of space and social movements, and I particularly enjoyed that. And to approach the question of space with some caution. And throughout the chapter, you keep on reminding us about the link between structures and agency, between history and geography. And so trying to engage with this question at the macro and the micro level, which leads you to then decide to engage with the question at really the meso level, the how question. How do these spaces become places of contention? And you particularly said a sentence that I'm going to build part of my, not criticism, but engagement on. So you say, space, after all, is not divorced from history, nor is spatiality divorced, nor is spatiality from political economy. And I think this is very, very important from a sociological perspective, but also to understand the concept of space and urban areas more broadly. So therefore, the question of what is urban about these social movements guides my discussion. And if social movements and upheavals arise at the time of discontent, then the more precise question is, what is it that creates discontent within urbanity? Why social movements in urban areas? But also I will move on in a bit to also rethink this question of, are the Arab uprisings urban uprisings mainly? And how do we then deal with the question of, which you describe very well and you document of how, I mean, of course these uprisings had different paths, but many of them started not from urban or from the periphery, if I may say. So the short answer, and of course you've heard the presentation, but the short answer that you give is that you develop a theory of urbanity and urban entitlements and rights to explain the potential of urban life and producing dissent. And here I'll start from this point and trying to argue that urbanity is a different mechanism than urbanization. And what I actually mean is that the study is starting from a standpoint of urbanity is a fait accompli. It's taken for granted, and we're analyzing from that point. And what I'm trying to suggest is the importance of urbanization as a mechanism, as a continuous process of capital accumulation and expansion, and also this process that creates these huge inequalities, uneven development, and etc. And what I'm trying to say is that the process of urbanization might be one answer to explain this or at least the diffusion of movements, in some cases, of course, not all of them, but in cases like Tunisia or Syria, from rural areas, or what I don't think rural is very accurate, but from the peripheries to the centers. And so this focus on urbanity and urban spaces kind of overlooks these very complex and very important dynamics of how urbanization is also a mechanism of how these uprisings emerged and how they exploded somehow in some countries. And so the focus on the squares in urban cities overlooks this process, and this is my first question to you. So how would we then, with the mechanisms of urban entitlement that you put forward, how would we then explain the rural dynamics that were also happening in these uprisings, and how do we not overlook the very important role of non-urban areas? But this also takes me to the point, to my second point, which is the dichotomy of urban-rural really accurate here? And are we really talking about urban versus rural? Because the paper, and you mentioned it, starts by saying that the paradox is that almost half of the Arab populations live in rural areas, but the revolutions mainly took urban spaces as their locus. And what I'm trying also to think here is it really a dichotomy between urban and rural, or is it more a question of center-periphery that is very related to the process of urbanization and not urbanity per se? And here, the urbanization becomes a mechanism of capital and power accumulation in the center. So the periphery is not necessarily rural. It could be suburban. It could be neighborhoods within urban areas. And here I think of the notion of Lefebvre, the citadin and the citizens. And I'm very happy that in your presentation you mentioned this, because I had a feeling when I was reading the paper that the big elephant in the room was this concept of citizen and the state. That the urban entitlement are very much linked to an idea of state development and an idea of citizenship, where, and what you call the urban paradox, where obligations come with entitlement. Mm-hmm. And then what about those people who are not fulfilling their obligations, and those that you write about in other books, so the quiet encroachment of so the social non-movements. So these people who do not actually fulfill their obligations, are they not, or do they have a feeling of entitlement simply because simply because they are citadins, they live in the city, or is the question here more a question of so is this entitlement an entitlement of being in a rural area or urban area, or is it not more a matter of class, positionality, and legality very much, being legal in that state? And this brings me to the point of the importance of the state, that I think is not very much conceptualized in the paper, but that plays an important role in in understanding these entitlements as a mechanism in and for themselves. So I was wondering whether you could tell us a bit more about this definition of urbanity as a fait accompli, and the urban entitlements, and how they are linked, because you mentioned this link to capitalism and to neoliberalism and to these big changes that are occurring, but also to state building and citizenship. And how do we then make sense of all people who are outside the state and outside legality, and who actually played an important role in these uprisings? My third point is about the notion of Tahrir as theater, which I think is very, very interesting, and the performative feature of the uprisings. Of course, it reminds us of a big literature in gender studies, but also, here I think there is, of course, the revolutions are exceptional moments, But I'm also I'm wondering, and I'm really pulling your leg here, are we not over-emphasizing an exceptionality and behavior? I mean, the moments are exceptional themselves, but is it really true that in Tahrir Square and other squares, class and gender differences completely disappeared? And this temporality of, I mean, we know and we've heard a lot about a lot of initiatives against harassment, so it seems that, a closer look does not really portray a completely egalitarian image the way it's been described. So here again, I'm trying to think of what is exceptional about these moments, and how does this play out with your concept of non-movements, where you say that in everyday life people are challenging the structures and the norms, and so what then becomes exceptional about challenging these norms in exceptional moments, but are these behaviors in themselves exceptional? And I'm thinking here of behavior within crowds, so behavior, for example, of people at mosques, where there is also a sense of performance so is this not crowd behavior in general, and is it exceptional to these revolutions? So I'll cut it short. I'll give you the paper later. But the final comment I want to say is that at the end you finish your paper saying political engagements and mobilizations cannot remain in squares for a long time, and you suggest that politics has to be adjusted to everyday life, and institutions need to be reformed and built. And here you differ, or I'm asking you if you actually differ with Harvey, who actually focuses more on the importance of building organizations and not this non-hierarchical horizontal approach to movements. So how would you think of today at this point in time, how would we think of the post-revolutionary moment where we perform politics outside the Midans, and how would you reflect on the importance of organization, or is politics as an individual everyday life? Thank you.
Thank you.
So do you want a few minutes to reply?
Yeah.
Okay. So and then we'll take a round of questions.
Okay. Thank you very much, Rima, for careful reading and for your comments. I'm not sure if I will be able to answer all of your questions, but I will try the ones that I feel that I'm able to. So I usually forget the questions that I might ask you to repeat, and that's a problem. Start from the last one. In fact, I have to say I was critical of when the Tahrir revolutionaries continued to remain in Tahrir even after Mubarak had been toppled. Yeah? Because I tend to think that there's a big difference between the time of insurrection and the time of post-revolution. The day after, when the dictator abdicates, the dynamics of contention changes. Right? Because those people, not necessarily activists, activists are not important, they are nothing if they are not supported by ordinary people, which makes contention ordinary, not extraordinary. Anything which is extraordinary can be toppled, can be smashed by the police, by the authorities, and so on. And that's, I think, the magical ordinary people who bring extraordinary act into the social mainstream and make it ordinary. And here is, I think, the breakthrough. Here is the difference when 5 or 1,000 activists go, nothing happens, right? But when their uncles, their mothers, their children, others join them, and that changes their dynamics. So I think that in post-revolution, in fact, they should have started organizing, actually, right?
to the back streets and farms and factories and unions and so on and so forth. In fact, because they didn't do it, they left all these spaces to the free riders. And free riders are the bigger winners, right, in post-revolutionary times. Big power in post-revolutionary times. And then can actually organize those those people who didn't participate, because suddenly they assume significant power. So yes, the role of organization becomes very important. So now let me just very quickly, I don't really, I actually somewhat question the dichotomy of rural-urban by saying that actually things have changed. I was actually giving an example of my time, my village, right? Which to me was really rural. It was agricultural largely. No urban amenities, right? And no kind of little means of communication and so forth. And largely self-sufficient, little really exchange. But things have changed now. When you go to the villages, we are very much connected to global processes. So therefore, I actually question. It is the officials who are saying 40% of the people are living in rural areas. In fact, a very as we know, definition of rural differs in different countries. Right? And so on. I don't want to go into that. So was this urban revolution? Not in the sense that I understand, though, urban movements. Because the concerns of a lot of those people, some of the concerns of a lot of people who went there did not necessarily derive from urban problematique that I mentioned what they are. Right? Corruption, dictatorship, lack of accountable government. These issues are not necessarily urban, right? Or this is not necessarily the problems of urban people. It's a broader sort of constituency that take place. But the expression of discontent, but the expression of a mobilization largely took place in the areas that we consider to be cities. But you're saying that there were also villages. But I'm also saying that. So in the villages, they mobilized too. But the question is, are they really villages? You know what I mean? And what were the causes? The story of Muhammad Bouazizi himself is a fascinating combination of how he's informed by the issues of land loan and dispossession of actually his land, his father's land, because of the bank, because they were in debt, right? And then moving on, he becomes a street vendor, right, in the city of Sidi Bouzid, not having permit. So that actually embodies that combination, the mix of concerns.
Great. Thank you, Asif. We'll collect a few questions. There's one here, and Nicola. So we can start.
Should I wait for the microphone?
Is there a mic?
Hello, and thanks so much. Thank you so much for your lecture. I first became acquainted with your work in my final year of undergrad when I was choosing between law school and pursuing a master's in Middle Eastern studies. So this was a pivotal time, and it's really it's a pleasure to see you here delivering the lecture. So I wanted to ask a question. I wanted to ask you a question about the primary thrust of your earlier work, the critique it has faced, and how would you respond to that now? Your some of your earlier work has argued that the atomized individuals, such as fruit sellers and street vendors in public squares and public spaces, have developed a collective solidarity with each other as they would happen to see each other day after day, sharing the same space, even if they don't directly engage with or acknowledge each other, and that they would instinctively and organically mobilize in the face
Yeah,
of
can you
the
keep
common
the
external
question
threat.
short?
Yes, of course. One of the critiques of this argument, however, is that the emphasis on the individual organically allying with the other sometimes may ignore or
Could you go to your question?
Yeah,
Yeah.
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 That this may ignore the deliberate organizational efforts of activists and the protester repertoire that they have perfected over many, many years, such as the April 6th movement in Egypt and the protests at soccer stadiums that have developed. So if you can please address, respond to, or situate that critique, please.
Thank you.
Sure.
Nicolas? That's him.
Hello. Thank you for a very comprehensive description of the results. I will be a little bit. I will raise three issues very fast. I promise. The first one is a discourse analysis of your speech, if I may, and then I will try to use this to make maybe a descriptive request in terms of empirical data compared to the first, and then I will even try to make a theoretical moral point about photographs. Very ambitious.
You have 2 seconds.
Very fast. I noticed when you talked about protesters, you took the backseat of the liberal regime, protesters being actually the ones who demand, rights, using the language of rights, entitlements, and obligations, right? The language of the citizenship. Fine. I was fascinated though when you went to describing the protests and you took the point of view of the state, then it was all about war, about how the state shuffles space to make sure that it's going to win the war against the protesters. How the Tahrir Square, for example, was introduced, through blocks, channeling the flows of people, blocking the flows of people. There was nothing there about liberal rights, obligations, nothing of that. It was about outright war, which I think it's my observation about your discourse. Now, my question would be, why don't we speak? Why don't we write? Or is there somehow a literature out there that writes from the point of view of protesters in terms of urban warfare, as the state actually does? Or are we, this is my more theoretical point, or are we too shy? And are we too somehow, morally obliged to speak still in terms of rights, obligations, and demands to the sovereign, and not in terms of urban warfare, all by recognizing that the sovereign, at the last instance, treats the protests as urban warfare and nothing more.
Thank you, Nicolas. Any other question? Yes, Ananya.
Asif, thank you for that wonderful talk. So I actually really appreciate that you focused on urbanity, because all day, in fact, we've been asking what is urban about urban social movements. But in thinking about urbanity, you asked us to consider the very beautiful story that you told us about how your parents became urban citizens, but also this question of how, despite Osmanization in cities such as Cairo, the state has not, in fact, been able to shut down street life and street politics. But Salwa Ismail, in her work on the protests in Tahrir and elsewhere, has argued that really what matters is not the Arab Square, but what matters are the back streets and the popular quarters, where, in fact, a very distinctive form of urbanity played out, which was the encounter between the police and young men of a very particular class. And that, she argues, created these repertoires of contention, but also created precisely, perhaps, the warfare. And that shows up, of course, in that incident between Bouzazi and the municipal policewoman, and that moment of confiscation, right? And his going sort of to the municipal police office and not getting a hearing. So I'm wondering how we should think about that sort of urbanity, but also those popular quarters and back streets. But what that does for me is raise two dilemmas and questions. One is around how we think about the state. And so I've been very interested in how what we have, what perhaps marks the urban, is a different kind of state, right? The urban for me is a mode of government. And it's a different kind of government than governing the rural. But the second is the class question. And how in those extraordinary moments, in those spectacular moments, perhaps different classes were held together in places like Tahrir. Because that, of course, there were a whole set of young people in those squares who had not had those encounters, who didn't live in the popular quarters and so on. So is that perhaps what defines then the Arab Square versus the popular quarters and the encounters with the police that have been that have become routinized in places like Cairo?
We'll take one more question, and then one more question.
I will forget.
Thank you very much, also because it's connected to Anania's question and it can be shorter than. Thank you, Asef, indeed, for a wonderful talk and a lot of ideas.
Where are you?
I'm here. Okay, very quickly, I was wondering when you made your case why you chose to talk about Tunisia and Habib Bourguiba Avenue, because it was not a real occupation. There was one big manifestation on 14th, the day that Ben Ali left, and there were smaller ones 2 days before. After Ben Ali disappeared, there were two major occupations on the Kasbah Square, a little more up north of the Medina, which are more comparable, I think, to what happened in Meydan, Pearl Square, Tahrir, etc., etc. So I wanted to understand why you chose Habib Bourguiba Avenue. And secondly, you asked the question in the beginning: what exactly in the urban brings people to dissent, right? To collectively mobilize? And when you look at, for example, the Tunisian case, I'm less familiar with other cases. One major group that was important were the popular classes, just to use the term once more. And they were connected through kinship and through solidarity networks that exist since a long time, because they're the children and grandchildren of the people who have migrated from the interior of the country. Whatever happened in the interior, there would be, they would show this solidarity. So they were the ones who brought basically the uprising from the interior to the city. And then the rest of the city followed indeed, which was really important. So I come back a little bit to my point of this morning, and perhaps you can elaborate on it. It's this relational aspect from urban citizens, urban dwellers, connected through kinship and solidarity networks with the interior of the country that really triggered the first clashes with the police forces and so on and so forth, even before they went into the streets, Habib Bourguiba, etc. And indeed, my last point was actually the one that Ananya just raised. And we talk about activists and normal people, but indeed, where are the classes, the social groups, and the different interests? Even identity or identitarian defined groups might play a role. Less so in Tunisia, but I presume in other places. Yes. Thank you.
Oh dear. So, yes, obviously, I mean, in the case of Tunisia, it began from the interior, right? Dakhel as opposed to Sahel. And there's been a lot of discussion and, in fact, writing about this distinction and the extent to which, those areas in Dakhel have been marginalized, and creating a person, a citizen like Mohammed Bouazizi. It's very true that actually moved up towards the north, and in fact, it didn't really took place. I mean, the occupation took place because the departure, when actually they went into Bourguiba Avenue, in fact, they were threatening to go all the way to Sidi Bou Said, right, in the north, when Ben Ali left. So there was really no need as to why they went to Bourguiba Avenue because of those features, that I mentioned, but especially because of the Ministry of Interior, right, is there. And I believe that also when you compare it with Kasbah, there was also some rallies in Kasbah, but as far as skirmishes with police is concerned, that is not a good space, as opposed to Bourguiba Avenue. So I'm trying to understand. Yes, police. I think police brutality has been really an issue in the poor neighborhood, and I agree with that. With the constant sort of surveillance of the poor, especially youth poor, and shunning them in particular from the urban spaces and that they desired to be present. And in fact, when the police disappeared, one argument is that for the poor, a revolution was won. They won it, right? Because they went away. And in fact, when they went away, very significant things really began to happen in the poor neighborhoods, right? In the peripheries. Land takeover, land occupation, massively really took over. So that brings me to your question of, are these people non-responsible, right? As opposed to citizens, because they don't do their obligation, they don't pay their taxes and so forth. I think this is part of, actually related to your lecture yesterday, this is, to me, is part of the process of redistribution. This is a part of the process of redistribution. The question, and I'm going actually back to you again, how do we do the redistribution, right? And I believe that bringing in the issues of property and redistribution is essential. But the question is, how do you do it? I think that these moments, these exceptional moments, revolutionary moments, is a time, is a time to do it. But the question is that it was not done enough. And there is a reason why it was done enough. There's a reason why. Only 14 factories were taken over by workers in Egypt. And the majority of them, the activists, would say that it is illegal to take over. It's illegal. But the revolution is not illegal, right? It has a different legitimacy, right? Because anyway, that's a different story that I have. These were revolutions of post-revolutionary times, when people were not thinking really in terms of revolution in the sense of the 1970s or 20th century. If you compare it with Iranian, Nicaraguan, and so on and so forth, the different type of, I would say, revolution. They were revolution with F, kind of a mix of really reform revolution. I can argue. So, oh yes.
He's up.
Yes.
The discourse.
I'm trying to understand actually your question. Well, the state acted in the way that it did, or they have been doing in terms of spatial, what I call counter square, because they are very much feared, right, of the possibility of the continuation of that kind of insurrection, right? But my argument, my discussion has been that what actually brought these people, the actors, those people, into that stage? What triggered it? What brought it? There is a whole, set of background, right? Where they live, what they want, what their desires are, right? What has been ignored, and so on and so forth, which I really described. I think that I don't want to make an automatic deduction that when you have those kind of background, then people necessarily would refer to that kind of insurrection. No. The whole thing, revolutions are not really planned in the way that it appears. It really happens. There's incredible spontaneity, there's an incredible not innovation, improvisation going on as they move on, right? So, yeah.
There was a question about
yes,
the
individual. Yeah, non-movements. Okay. I have been identified usually by by the concepts and perspectives that I try to develop. So because I have developed this notion of non-movements, then I am a supporter of non-movements. Because I have talked, is more acute is post-Islamism. Because I have developed this notion of post-Islamism to explain certain changes that are happening and why people and so on, then I'm actually said that I'm a supporter of post-Islamism. I'm explaining this. I have, of course, my personal view. If you ask me, I'll tell you, right? So therefore, I'm not necessarily advocating that the way is non-movements. In fact, I'm saying that whatever we talk, what we say, they are doing it. They are doing it, right? I'm just showing it how they do it and why they do it, right? So therefore, the presence or existence of non-movement, which I believe that actually is pretty effective, does not exclude the existence or the emergence of organized social movements at all. Of course, during that time before the Egyptian or even Tunisian revolution, it was organized activism actually was going on, but very limited because it is very dangerous. It's a repressive state, right? What I'm actually doing now in the present book that I'm doing to show what happened to these non-movements during the revolution. In fact, I'm discovering that a lot of non-movements became movements, right? Because there was an opportunity and they began to organize themselves and so on. And I had actually somewhat predicted that again they will go back to non-movements. In fact, they are doing it, right? Because of the possibility of the nature of the state, unfortunately, that actually does not allow these things to continue.
Okay, we're short on time. We have to stop, but I'm sure Professor Bayat can answer your questions after when we close. So please join me in thanking Professor Bayat for his very thought-provoking talk. And there's the movie at the Orient Institute at 7:30 for those who are interested. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.